Good morning and welcome to the Brazilian American Chamber of Commerce's first installment in the series COVID-19, What Lies Ahead, a discussion of agro-industry in Brazil and the United States. I am John Welch, the Executive Director of the Chamber, and on behalf of the Chamber, we wish you all health and safety in this difficult time. Agro-industry has faced several challenges over the last few years. COVID-19 has exacerbated these already difficult circumstances. The challenges to policymakers in Brazil and in the United States are substantial. The Secretary of Agriculture from the state of São Paulo, Gustavo Junqueira, and University of Illinois professor Nicholas Paulson joined PwC's Malvestio today to discuss how agro-industry is dealing with the pandemic, both in Brazil and in the United States. I will briefly introduce our guests, but you can find their full bios on the link that contained in your reminder and your invitation, and also on our website. We have the honor of hosting Secretary of Agriculture of São Paulo State, Gustavo Junqueira, who was appointed Secretary of Agriculture for the state of São Paulo by Governor João Glória in January 2019. Among his possible policy initiatives, Secretary Junqueira is, in partnership with Google, mapping 125 miles of farming roads and providing addresses to 350,000 farms to transform São Paulo's agribusiness logistics. Mr. Junqueira served as the 25th president of the Brazilian Rural Society, Brazil's most prestigious farmers association, where he founded the Brazil Climate, Forest, and Agriculture Coalition. In his private sector career, Mr. Junqueira has invested in grain and sugarcane production and cattle ranching. He was managing partner at Brasilpar, an independent investment bank, and served as board member for several companies, including Rumo Railway, Pine Corporate Bank, Aztec Construction, and Moinho Paulista Flour Mills. Mr. Junqueira holds a bachelor's degree in business administration from FAP and an MBA from Thunderbird School of Management in Arizona. Nicholas Paulson is an associate professor and director of graduate programs in the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Economics at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. His research and extension programs focus on finance, farm, and risk management, and agricultural policy. He teaches courses in agricultural finance in the undergraduate and graduate levels. In 2019, he spent a sabbatical working on trade and agricultural issues as senior economist on the Council of Economic Advisors in the Executive Office of the President at the White House. He received his MS and PhD degrees in economics from Iowa State University. Finally, our moderator today is Ana Malvestio, partner of PwC and an important member of the Chamber. She leads the Brazil Business Network and Brazilian Tax Desk, having significant experience with international and domestic tax planning and corporate governance for family business. In addition to coordinating corporate restructurings and mergers and acquisitions, she has worked extensively to increase foreign investment in agribusiness in Brazil. Before I turn the screen over to Anna, I would ask that you please make your questions using the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. You can make them at any time, and we will look to answer them after the panel discussion during the Q&A period. Thank you very much. Anna?
Thank you, John. Thank you very much. Can you hear me well? Okay. So, John, there is an important information when you introduced me that you have forgotten to mention. I was born in countryside of São Paulo, the city that it's called Agribusiness capital in Brazil, Ribeirão Preto. Probably you have never heard about, but this is interesting, and the free translation means black stream. Ribeirão Preto, I grew up seeing and watching just a plant, sugarcane, the region, the sugarcane sector is the biggest one here. I grew up seeing just one plant being transformed in sugar, that's food, energy by cogeneration, and fuel by ethanol. So this is what makes me be passionate about this sector. In Brazil and US, they are two big players. And this is why it's really a big pleasure to be here and to moderate this panel today with Secretary Gustavo Junqueira and Professor Nick Paulson. Both of them, please receive my admiration. Agribusiness in US and Brazil means #1 and #2 in exportation and production in many products, in many, as we can explain an example, soybean, corn, coffee, sugar, ethanol, orange juice, beef, poultry. During this pandemic, agribusiness is the sector, of course, is going to have effects, but less because it's so essential that brings food to the population. And to understand the facts and what we can expect from US and Brazil, I'd like to start with Secretary Gustavo Junqueira, asking him what we can expect from agribusiness in Brazil. Please, Secretary.
Thank you, Anna, for the explanation on Brazil and São Paulo state especially. And thank you, John, for the introduction, and all of you, including Professor Paulson, which is a pleasure to be here and share this Zoom platform with you. Well, Brazil, as has been mentioned here before by Anna, together with the United States are the two biggest players in agribusiness, not only in the production of commodities and in the farms, in the farming, but also in all the transformation of those crops into food that are packaged foods, food that will directly go to the tables and of all the families, not only in Brazil, but in the US, but all over the world. We are also the two biggest exporters of food in the world. Just in terms of comparison, I put here a few data. Just in terms of size, the United States, in terms of population, Brazil has 210 million people, in the US, 330 million people. In terms of size, we have 1.5 million square kilometers, in the US, 9.4 million square kilometers. So it's a very close size that we have, but the US has more deserts and mountains and lakes, and we have more rivers, no big mountain, and more areas for more farmland. Brazil today, if you account for everything that has been used in terms of land use, for cattle ranching, for agriculture, forestry, Brazil uses approximately 30% of its territory for food production, for agribusiness. In the US, approximately 45%. Nick may correct me there later if I did some mistake. Maybe forestry is could bring this number a little bit more, but that's what I had here. One of the main products that we are producing today, the two main is soybeans, where we have exported only in the last quarter of this year approximately 14 million metric tons of soybeans per month, just post-harvest. So we're talking about here the month of April, May, and June. So it has been a record in terms of exports, mainly exports to China. Today, Brazil has a high concentration of exports to China in terms of soybeans. I would say that roughly 70% everything that we export in terms of soybeans go to Chinese companies. And beef, I think animal protein in general. Just to give you a beef statistics, we have today more or less a production of 10 million metric tons of beef per year, whereas the US today produces more or less 13 million. So 30% more in the US. But here it's an interesting number, because Brazil produces 10 million metric tons with 200 million herds of cattle, and the US does 30% more production of beef with only roughly 100 million herds of cattle. So there's a lot of potential for Brazil here to really gain productivity, and that goes for everything. In terms of logistics is the same thing. In terms of consumption is the same thing. So it's a big untapped, I would say, area of the world where agribusiness can grow. There's a huge expectation for Brazil that Brazil will fulfill at least 40% of the world demand. And according to the FAO, food demand will grow approximately 20% within the next few decades. So there's not many countries in the world that could actually fulfill close to half of that demand. Of course, during this pandemic time, there are many things that we are questioning ourselves. Are we really gonna eat as much as the previous generation or this current generation has been eating? We're gonna change our habits. We're gonna use less clothing. Everything that Brazil today relies on, approximately 30% of its economy is based on agribusiness. Not that Brazil is a big farmland, but yes, because Brazil has invested in economy of scale, technology, new markets, and is now taking the advantages of having done so, or creating this massive industry here based on land use. Now we are able to develop all other parts of the business. So just as an example, John Deere, the big tractor manufacturer, the American tractor manufacturer, has its largest business in the US. But it's a business where they are on a daily basis competing to keep their market share. On the other hand, they are the largest one in Brazil, and but they're not actually competing with the other competitors to keep market share, because the pizza pie here is growing. So what they're doing here, they're expanding their production because they're too much to work. So there's many points here, Anna, that you have highlighted. So we can talk about the potential and additional potential in soybeans and cotton, sugar, corn. For a few years ago, we were importers of corn. 10 years ago, we were importing corn. Now we are exporting corn. So there's a lot going on. And of course, I would say that this is a good place to invest right now. All the discussion regarding sustainability, environmental protection, farming, this is investment in logistics, infrastructure. This is part of the game. This is part of the whole discussion, that we need to have a very open, honest, and transparent dialogue, so that we can really define how things should go. And the US and Brazil, for sure, are the major, together with China, on the other hand, as a consumer, and Southeast Asia, we are the major stakeholders in this whole discussion. So thank you again, and I return it to you so that we can hear Nick here. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary. This is very helpful, especially during my time working in New York. I can see there are a big lack of information about Brazil agribusiness, and also about the US agribusiness. And there, of course, there are regions in US, agribusiness is much more known and the data are available, but I regret to have much more information in New York. And one thing that I think it's important to discuss, usually Brazil and US discuss with the customers, with the markets that we export. But usually I think there is a huge space for US and Brazil also to discuss. The big players, we can cooperate, especially facing the challenges of COVID-19 situation. There are a huge space to work and build a very clear and transparent communication between these two big players. And I'm going to turn it to you, Professor Nick Paulson. I would love to have your view, what we can expect from agribusiness in the US, please.
All right, thank you, Ana, and Secretary Junqueira, John, everybody for the invitation. Thanks to all our participants for being here. I am, as John introduced me, I'm a professor at the University of Illinois. I also grew up on a what I would describe as a pretty typical Midwestern corn and soybean farm in the state of Minnesota in the U.S. And now obviously live in Illinois and work for the university, but still very much tied to the family farm. My comments, I guess, just more to kind of supplement what the secretary had to say. I think he set the stage very well with some big picture issues. I'll try to add to those. I'll admit I'm going to be probably a little biased towards corn and soybean and kind of the major crop production. We'll have some comments about livestock markets as well, but of course, cattle and hogs eat corn and soybeans, so that's kind of the starting point for the entire supply chain, so to speak, when it comes to agriculture. The other maybe unfortunate aspect of me being a professor is that we can't do anything without slides. So I do have a couple of slides that I'm going to share here as I'm making a few comments in response to this first question and some of the other things we'll talk about this morning. Maybe though, just a very, very general starting point. I'm probably going to cover a few things today or talk about a few things, short-term hopefully short-term issues that are relatively negative when it comes to agriculture, particularly here in the U.S., whether that be some of the trade challenges that the industry has faced over the last few years or what we've seen develop in the last few months with COVID-19, just kind of adding to the problem, and the extended period we're now in with much lower commodity prices than we'd had in the 6 or 7 years prior to 2013. So, roughly the last 6 or 7 years have been much lower price and lower income years at the farm level in the U.S. So, maybe the first thing that I'll share with you is first a great picture of our campus here at Illinois, and then again, just kind of talking about things from a general perspective, but using corn and soybeans as my main example. This gives you a history over the last 30 years of where the corn that we produce in the U.S. has gone to, some of the major use categories. And maybe the one thing to point out here first is the blue line, which represents mainly food and industrial uses are relatively small. The big component of that blue series is the corn that we use to process into ethanol production. And you can see that was a huge growth area that we experienced from the mid-2000s through about 2012. And we've seen some leveling off, and then with COVID, a fairly major drop in demand for corn for ethanol production. We've also seen kind of a steady increase in demand for domestic feed use for our domestic livestock markets. Nowhere near the growth we experienced in ethanol demand recently, but a steady increase as populations grow and we continue to eat more and more meat in the U.S. But one area that I think is probably an area of concern for U.S. farmers is the relative lack of growth in U.S. corn exports. represents 15 to 20% of total production, and we've been pretty flat in absolute terms in terms of the number of bushels or the number of metric tons that we've been exporting. And, you know, as a result of that kind of stable export level over time, we've lost a considerable amount of U.S. market share when it comes to corn exports, which is shown here in the black line. And you can see that over time, I've included some of the other major corn exporters, and as the secretary pointed out, Brazil has really taken a large role as one of the major exporters, global exporters of corn in the U.S., as well as Argentina. And then, of course, we have Russia and the Ukraine and some of the other former Soviet countries. And you know, between the four of us, the U.S., Brazil, and Argentina, and the former Soviet Union, that's really the main component of global corn exports. So, you know, this is an area I think that the U.S. is going to need to focus on. Ethanol demand sort of was a very positive demand shock for U.S. farmers in terms of corn use, and really helped to support farm incomes. But with that market stabilizing, I think at best, at least in the short to medium term, I think you know, looking at areas where we can grow either corn exports or livestock exports so that we can feed more corn domestically is going to be an area that we need to spend a lot of time focusing on to kind of keep our positioning here in the U.S. And I couldn't agree more with the comment earlier about the U.S. and Brazil being major players here, and both benefiting from cooperating together as major players in the U.S. Export market. Kind of the same thing for soybeans. We've seen pretty steady growth in both domestic crush, domestic use, as well as exports, again, with the exception of the last few years due to some of the trade issues that have been going on with the U.S. and the trade policies that we've implemented since 2018. But even with that growth in exports in terms of bushels or tons, we have seen a steady decline in U.S. market share. The U.S. was the dominant soybean exporter, but as Brazil mainly has entered the market here, you know, Brazil has actually overtaken the U.S. in terms of being the largest soybean exporter in terms of market share the past few years. And we've seen a pretty steady, serious decline in market share for soybean exports on the part of the U.S. Yeah, the other thing, you know, that was very aggregate national level data. I also wanted to share and just make a few comments about what you see now on the screen. And this is something that is very much specific to grain operations here in Illinois, but is very illustrative of the scenario and the situation that grain farms are in currently in the U.S. So what you see per acre returns that farms have earned over the last 20 years. You can see the high profitability years, thanks largely to the growth in ethanol demand that were experienced in kind of the second half of the 2000s into the early 2010s. But you can also see basically the break-even situation that farmers have been in Illinois and really throughout the U.S. Crop production farms anyway, the break-even situation they've been in with the lower commodity prices that we've experienced since 2013. Again, COVID, which we'll talk more about as we continue on today, is a factor that's contributing to that, but it's not the only thing that's led to some of these lower incomes and lower price levels that we've seen really for the last 7 years. So with that, I think I'll turn it back over to Anna, and we can move on.
Anna, before you move on, I just want to shed some light to Nick's comments here. I think it's would be beneficial to everyone participating. Nick, it's interesting to see your charts, because if you look in terms of volume for corn and soybeans in the U.S., it hasn't reduced very much. The fact is that we had a major growth in terms of market when China came into play. So Brazil took the advantage there, not because he was displacing the U.S., but because the U.S. at some point it has exhausted its capacity to plant more soybeans or more corn. They have a very high productivity yields, and therefore there's not much more water to do that, and you have the limitation of the winter. Here in Brazil, so we had an untapped market back in, I don't know, early 2000s, and then we expand in terms of land use. We improve our productivity tremendously over time. Soybeans actually have surpassed the U.S. In some areas. Corn, we're still lagging behind, but the fact is that we were able, as two big giants, and then I'll add Argentina there with their problems, but Brazil and the U.S. were able to fulfill all the demand that China has decided to import from the world instead of growing within their domestic market. So here it's an interesting thing. The last chart that you have presented, where you show the returns there and then the finance part of it, shows another characteristic that in that case, Brazil and the U.S. will be in a more fierce competition because we have lower costs. You have the U.S. dollar, which is a hard currency, and everything is based on U.S. dollar. Nowadays, as you said, we have low U.S. dollar price for soybeans and corn and other commodities, but just to focus on those two. And in Brazil, we had a major devaluation because of other problems for COVID and for political and everything, and that we have reduced our interest rates here too. So farmers in Brazil are selling their production at their highest price in local currency, in reais, ever. Chinese are buying corn and soybeans at the lower US dollar price ever. So it's great for the Chinese, it's great for the Brazilian farmer. And if you put into that equation the cost of logistics, the freight from Brazil or from the Americas to China, because of the drop in the oil prices and the low demand in terms of freighters, it's also a low cost now. So Chinese is buying it at a very low price. They're growing their inventories there, and Brazil and the U.S. are producing. The negotiations getting into the way there, but I think it's. I just want to highlight it there. There's how competition and partnership, because without the size of Brazil and without the size of the U.S., this business, which is a business of economies of scale, wouldn't be possible to be made. So I don't know if you agree there, but just I think it was an interesting point that you helped here.
So maybe since you bring a very important, okay, Professor, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, that's fine. Go ahead, Anna.
Okay, so what I was supposed to say is, I believe we can expect an important growth of China, despite we are discussing estimatives of GDP like Brazil that start January 2020 in an estimative of +2, and we are discussing if it's going to be -8, -11, but the GDP for agribusiness itself in Brazil remain growing. And I believe the same in US. I think if we isolate the GDP from agribusiness in US, even though I don't have this number, the expectation is to continue to grow. So considering the expectation, the strong expansion of China, considering COVID-19 situation and trade war, what do you both of you expect to happen in agribusiness in Brazil and US? Nick, I'd like to start with you.
So expectations given COVID-19, short-term expectations or long-term expectations?
Can be short term.
Okay, short-term, COVID has introduced a number of challenges for across the entire agricultural supply chain. It's probably illustrated some potential weaknesses, but I think in general, it's also illustrated how resilient ultimately our agricultural supply chains are. So while we've experienced some short-term disruptions, whether that be meat packing plants, temporarily closing down because of worker illness, or some of the other consumer goods that maybe were temporarily unavailable at grocery stores just because of the huge shift that we saw from people eating at restaurants to buying everything at home as most of our states went into quarantine or lockdown or stay at home periods for months or more. It's been, I think, surprising how resilient those supply chains have been. So, I think COVID is introducing a lot of challenges in the short term that are creating necessary government responses through various stimulus packages to help American consumers, to help U.S. farmers with some direct assistance, with some low interest borrowing, some potential loan forgiveness on some large loan programs. We're I think officially now in a recession in the U.S. based on how we define that. We're experiencing record unemployment levels that we haven't seen since the Great Depression. So we're going through some very major short-term shocks and some short-term pain, and the ag industry has not been sheltered from that. But I do agree that the moderate to longer-term outlook, given we expect growth throughout the world in incomes and demand for meat. As incomes grow, I think the long-term outlook still remains very positive for agriculture. But again, the challenge that we see, and it's been kind of exacerbated by the fact that we've been in now this 6 or 7 year period of lower prices and lower incomes, where we haven't seen production costs adjust down as much, and we've seen the need for kind of continued what I will call ad hoc federal assistance from the government for agriculture, just to kind of keep most farm operations at break-even levels. I think the real question is over 2020, 2021, and maybe going into 2022, is this continued federal aid that we've seen in the last 2 or 3 years that accounts for 25-30% of farm income in those years. Is that something that is sustainable? And at what point is the U.S. ag industry going to have to maybe accept that there may be some fairly major structural changes that have to take place? Maybe accelerating, definitely continuing the trend of moving towards larger, more integrated operations, which we've seen in many of our livestock industries, but I think we'll see even more of if we continue on this path over the next 2 or 3 years, even in the crop sector. The U.S. is still largely very much a family farm-based crop production sector. The farms are still relatively large, but they're still farms that are the scale at which supports a family or maybe 2 households. And I think we'll just continue to see more consolidation, fewer farms at the lower end of our farm size distribution, and more farms at the higher end of our farm size distribution. I think that's just going to be a natural outcome of kind of the financial stress period that we're currently in.
Thank you, Nick. Secretary Gustavo, in relation to the trade war and what Nick just explained about ag in US, what the impacts can you see for Brazil?
Well, we cannot rely as a country or as a company, for that matter, on a trade war, because wars have they have a beginning, they have the fight, and they have an end. And so we have to build your business as a country or as a company on something that you really rely that you have a competitive advantage. Clearly, in the case of Brazil, I would say is cost of production. We have been investing in technology for a long time. In fact, this whole revolution that we would call this tropical agriculture revolution started with the Americans. I think was the initiative of the Rockefeller Foundation that really sparked in Brazil the will to go after new land in the Brazilian Midwest and discover what are the deficiencies that this land have, which is it's a poor soil. What are the deficiencies that we can calibrate so that we can produce in those areas in a very large scale, different from what we have here in the state of Sao Paulo, where I am the secretary. Here, the average farm averages approximately 66 hectares, which is, I don't know the conversion exactly to acres, but it's a small farm. It's wouldn't be considered a big farm for soybeans or corn. So it's a family business too. What has happened in Brazil is that once we move to the Midwest, where is an area with no population. I mean, the state of Mato Grosso has approximately 3 million people living there. So it's a huge land. I mean, I think it's the size of Texas or something. So with the appropriate land and soil for soybean, corn, cotton production, with no people, so not much to fight for, no Indians, as we had seen in the beginning of the U.S. So actually, we set up in that area, and I believe was the only or one of the only settlements or colonization of an area by their own people, because we moved Brazilians from the south of Brazil, consolidated states in the south of Brazil, to this new area, and they have created that from the 70s until now. These major operations that are corporate operations that they can manage. With the largest producer here has a portfolio of 400,000 hectares. So if the average farm in the state of São Paulo is 66 hectares, he manages his portfolio is 400,000 hectares. On top of that, he can produce 2 or 3 crops, because he can have a summer corn, then he goes for soybeans, and in the middle of that, he can feed cattle with planted grass. So it's actually a open air manufacturing facility for proteins, both vegetable and animal. So what we see here is costs that are being reduced tremendously, not only for those new participants in the Midwest of Brazil, but also for the old farmers in the south and the southeast of Brazil, because based on that economy of scale, they also were benefited by lower costs of inputs and tractors and everything else. Brazil has modernized its agriculture based on the American teachings. We have tropicalized, or we have adapt everything to our environment, and therefore we were able to control our own destiny here. China was certainly a breakthrough in this whole dynamics, together with GMO soybeans that came approximately in the same time. So we moved or shift from the European customers, the European markets, to the Asian markets, and we introduced the GMO soybeans. That was definitely a green revolution that happened. And therefore, what I see going forward is more demand, not only in China. I think China, for sure, you have to take care of one concentration there, right? We rely too much on China today for agri markets, but we have to focus on Southeast Asia, India, and all these countries in that part of the world that are growing, are developing, and are increasing their purchasing power. So they will buy more food. Definitely, that's the way we will go. And so in the short term, I see that COVID has the same thing as in the US, has been very resilient. Different from the US, we didn't have any shortage of products at the supermarkets, a grocery store, but we had very few cases of COVID-19 at the meat packers, because different from the US, we have smaller plants here, not as big as the one we have in the US, and more separated in different areas of the country. So I see that we are strong even within the COVID pandemic, and now we're going to move towards a more consolidation going forward to these markets. The trade war is something that is for sure benefiting Brazil. We're doing okay. I think at some points we mix ideology and political things with business. I think we should focus more on business than politics when discussing new markets and agribusiness. But I think we're doing okay. I think we are actually taking the advantage of this confusion between China and the US, and we're plowing away.
Thank you. Considering the positive views of growing expansion, one aspect is really important, and I'd like to listen to both of you. And I would start with Professor Nick. Could you please explain how sustainability agenda is being prioritized to agribusiness in the US? And I also, after you, I'd like to listen Secretary Gustavo. Please, Nick.
Sure. So again, I'll try to comment generally kind of across the ag supply chain. We have a number of initiatives or a number of activities related to sustainability in the US, as I'm sure it's the case in Brazil as well. So if we start at the consumer level, I think, food producers, food companies, agribusinesses have recognized that US consumers, particularly higher income US consumers, are interested in knowing more information about the food products that they're buying, how they're produced, sustainability and environmental considerations that may have been made in the production process for those products that they're buying. And they're willing to pay a premium for that. Now, that's not something that's necessarily taking over the entire industry, but I do think that there has been serious, or we know that there's been serious relative growth in the areas for fresh foods, healthy foods, food products that provide that information and link the consumer back more directly to the production methods and the production regions in which those products were made. And then so the companies are implementing things to recognize that and capture some of those premiums that they can get on those products. I would still view that as a, and I don't mean this in any kind of negative way, but a relative niche market within the overall food industry of the U.S., but a market that is definitely growing. And then how that trickles back to the farmer, again, from a very niche perspective, I think we have seen growth, or maybe a reverse in direction back to local food movements. So farmers producing food directly for sale to consumers through cooperative organizations, community-supported agriculture, farmers markets. Again, this represents a very small percentage of overall agricultural production. More of it is still more the, again, the industrial scale, high technology type stuff. But these are areas where there are opportunities, I think, for particularly smaller farmers who aren't operating at the commercial scale, ways for those farmers to stay in business by directly connecting to consumers, and capturing basically the retail margin themselves, rather than working with intermediaries and processing and the packing industry and those types of things. In terms of the commercial scale production in the US, there's also a lot of movement and interest, policy directed initiatives toward adopting more sustainable practices. So, again, kind of speaking from a crop production expertise, crop production focus in the work that I do and in my background, a lot of the federal policies related to conservation in the US now, I would say historically in my lifetime have been more focused on protecting environmentally sensitive land by just taking it directly out of production through the Conservation Reserve Program that we have here in the US. But just in the last few farm bills over the last 10 to 15 years, we've seen major growth in conservation programs which are focused on working lands. So providing assistance to farmers to implement sustainability practices and cover the costs of those, recognizing that there are potentially long-term, definitely long-term environmental benefits, but also potentially long-term financial benefits back to the farmer if they can protect and enrich both soil and water quality of their farms and in the regions that they live in. But there's upfront costs associated with changing and switching to some of those practices. So I don't see that as a trend that will be changing. In fact, I only see that to continue to accelerate. And I think farmers in general are by nature good stewards of the land and are very interested in adopting any kind of practices or technologies that can benefit from a sustainability perspective, and also potentially enrich the viability of their operation from a financial perspective as well. And we're identifying, a lot of work is going on at universities and agricultural colleges to try to identify things like that. One of the big areas at the University of Illinois, I know, is a lot of work is going into cover crop research. So looking at ways to use that winter that we have in the US where we can't produce a productive crop, but we can plant a cover crop, maybe a grass that provides some additional nitrogen, protects the soil over the winter, and can reduce our use of synthetic fertilizers and other types of chemicals. So those are I think the big directions that I see things moving in from a sustainability perspective.
Excellent, thank you. I turn to you, Secretary Gustavo.
Yeah, I think it was a very good comments of Professor Nick. We are in different stages of development. I think the U.S. has achieved this point where they have all the land being worked very well. The programs for conservation are old, dated back to the beginning of the 20th century, Theodore Roosevelt as president. So it has been a long time. What you have pointed out is it's very interesting how to finance, how to help farmers that are good caretakers of the land to introduce new technology. Technology that will save water, technology that will, in some cases, combine natural vegetation, natural grass with a working model for the land. Brazil has a different different ecosystem. It's a tropical environment, so things here grow very fast. So all the pests they regenerate very fast. So the use of chemical, if you they're part of the business of the agribusiness here. But the future is biological for sure. So we have been investing a lot in Brazil in developing new technology for biological products that can reduce our use of chemicals. And that's not from an ideological perspective, but it's also because we depend a lot on foreign imports for fertilizers, for all the basic components for the chemical industry. So it is a way so that we can get stronger in terms of managing our own destiny and developing an industry here that will be in tune what markets are actually require and will require even more. I think it's interesting that the way the world has portrayed Brazil is that we are invading the Amazon and deforesting, cutting all the trees down so that we can produce, farm what we have been farming, which is not true. I mean, we have been increasing productivity over the last 30 years at a pace that hasn't been seen in the world ever. In 1970, we were one of the largest importers of food in the world. The average Brazilian family would spend approximately half of their family income to buy food. Today, it's 15%. Today, we are the top 3 exporters in the world in terms of, and we still have 66% of all original vegetation is still intact. So it's a very large part of the Brazilian territory. And if you think as a portfolio manager, it's a very high carrying costs, because we know the value of it, but it doesn't, you cannot have cash flow out of that asset that you own. So it's a math that's not easy to work. And on top of that, different from other countries in the other world, especially I think the European countries, the Brazilian agribusiness is a private business. It's a pure private capitalist business. What I want to say is that you can plant soybeans, corn, sugarcane, cotton anywhere you want. Of course, you have the times of the year that you cannot plant because of the contamination of keep planting soybeans over and over. Then you're going to have the nematoids and the other problems. But if you respect the agronomical aspects of it, you can plant anything, anywhere, anytime you want. So the law here is that has been introduced in 2012 for environmental protection, is that you have a percentage of your property that you have to keep that as a natural reserve. In the states of the Southeast and South, that percentage is 20%. So if I keep 20%, I can do anything I want with the land that I have. So once you go to the Amazon region, that percentage goes up to 80%. So to farm, if you buy 100%, if you buy a 100 acre of land, you have to keep as a natural vegetation 80%. You can farm 20. What is the big discussion here? Is that the farmer has the right to cut down the 20% and plant their crops. This is the law. Okay, one thing is the law, the other thing is the market. Oh, the market doesn't accept that anymore. The market wants you to have 100% protected. Okay, then we enter into the business discussion. How much that costs? How can we actually introduce policy, as Professor Nick has said, that will help the farmer yield enough in their operation that he can keep that part of the forest intact, that we don't expand our business going north, going to the Amazon, that we invest in infrastructure in other areas of the country. So this is a big discussion between policy, markets, and in the middle of that, there's business. So I think we are in a way that we need to get better in terms of communication, how to communicate well what we're doing, how we're doing that. Behind all these statistics, there is farmers, families, and a whole population, and that we're doing high tech in terms of the way we farm here and the way we protect. So I don't know if it was clear in the explanation, but I'm open to dive in more details. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm planning to keep the 20 minutes remaining for the panel to have the participants' questions. So I'm going to make one more to Nick and Gustavo, and then I'm going to turn to the participants' question. This question I would give to you, Professor Nick Paulson. What is missing to Brazil and US? I'd like you to cover both from your perspective. What is missing for agribusiness in the US and in Brazil to be as famous and have the same image that Australia agribusiness?
I get to be the first one to answer that? Oh. Me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Can everybody still hear me? Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
So the question, if I got the question right, what is missing from the U.S. and Brazil in terms of being as famous as the Australians?
Yes.
So maybe I'm
in relation to the image. Sorry, especially the image that Australians have.
Okay. So maybe I'm going to answer that question first, and maybe talking about very briefly. I think some of the public image issues that we face in the U.S. in terms of how the general public views farmers and farm operations. And I think, one thing I'm going to go back to is, I think both Secretary Gustavo and I have talked about farm size, and obviously a small farm in the U.S. is different than a small farm in Brazil, and a big farm in the U.S. is different than a big farm in Brazil. And it's not just because of the confusing acres to hectares calculation. But I think one thing in the U.S. that challenges U.S. agriculture is a public perception issue about what a family farm looks like, and what the public would view or characterize as being a corporate farm. And the reality that those two things are really not as different as I think the general public thinks that they are. So for very good and valid reasons in the US, from a government, federal, state, local level, it doesn't matter. We value the family farm. We value the strength of our food system, our place in the world as being able to grow food not only for ourselves, but for a good percentage of the rest of the world. And we have a long history of wanting to protect that industry with policy that provides risk management and income support. However, there is I think, sort of a public backlash that has developed over the last few decades over, viewing large farms, corporate farms, in a more negative light. And so I think a challenge that the U.S. has is communicating and really marketing what a family farm is nowadays compared to what it may have been 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. And the reality is that has changed. Farms have become bigger, farms have become more specialized, and farms are and need to be operated as businesses nowadays. And I don't think that farmers should have to or need to apologize for that. But I do think that we need to educate consumers that, even a corporate structure for a farm doesn't mean that it's not a family business and not something that's run with good values and good stewardship. But the consumer also needs to recognize that these are businesses, and there does need to be profitability in place. Otherwise, business cannot operate without a profit. So, I don't know if that was a very good or direct answer to your question, but I view that as one of the biggest public relations challenges that farms face with U.S. consumers. And I'm sort of out of time, but another issue we face in the U.S. and I'd be curious to see if it's an issue in Brazil is we've had genetically modified organisms, GMOs, now for many years. And I think that we've largely educated our population that about what genetically modified organisms mean with regard to safety issues, with regard to production potential, and the role that they'd play and in providing enough food for the world. We still have groups that advocate against them, and there are still health and safety concerns from some people. But that's been another, I think, public relations issue that agriculture has faced, in that we expect these huge productivity gains out of agriculture, but then we're also criticized or viewed negatively for using some of the methods that have been very successful to get those productivity increases. So again, I don't know if I directly answered your question. I didn't necessarily compare us so much to Australia, but I think those are the big challenges we face in terms of public perception here in the U.S.
Professor, I strongly agree with your views, especially the answer that I'd like to bring to participants' attention, and is the need of better communication that you strongly cover. And I'm going to ask the Secretary if you can cover the GMO aspect from Brazilian perspective. Please, Secretary.
I think the answer that again, I mean, I don't know Australia very well. I've been actually exploring Australia now to understand how a country very big, with a big desert, small population, have been very so successful. This is a country, for those that don't know, that hasn't had a recession in, if I'm not mistaken, 36 years. It's impressive. And they have been able to manage their economy very well. And regarding agribusiness, what I can say about Australia is that they have a very good marketing strategy.
Yes.
Just take China as an example. The Australians have an office in China that has, I don't know, roughly 150 people, and only working towards the grocery store, companies promoting their beef, promoting their cheese, promoting their milk. And Brazil has, I don't know, 10 people, 3 people. It's not something that is taken seriously by Brazilians to promote their products, their business outside of Brazil. The US does it well, also has a very good active foreign affairs arm for business, as the USTR works very well. But Brazil is a young player into this whole arena. So he hasn't has been following the steps of the US. So that's why I think we are at the same time we are competitors, but we are partners. We have adopted GMO as much as in the US. We as a country have no problem with the GMO. The laws and the regulations are were passed in a way that we can actually have conditions to work with that. We are working on GMO for sugarcane, work on GMO for other products, other crops that are not worldwide, and I think we're going to be successful there. I think the point that that was highlighted is that agribusiness, farming, food production, this is science. This is pure science. I mean, if we think anything different from that, it's a major mistake. So Brazilian farmers, as I can say, they are early adopters of technology, different from other parts of the world where you have a how can I call it, a traditional, a cultural agriculture, or a parent transferred to the next generation the way they were cultivating or producing cheese in France, for example. No, here's what's the technology, how much does it cost, how can I make it and make it available to the public as fast as possible. So this is, so if a professor, if a scientist come with a new idea, we are willing to test that right away. And the perception that was, and this is a narrative war, right? Brazil, before GMO, was exporting, just use soybeans as an example, approximately 70%, 80% of its soybean to Europe was a regular soybean, not non-GMO. After 2000, late 90s, China shows up again, and GMO shows up, and we start diverting our production to China and using GMO, because the Chinese were buying GMO because they understand the dynamics of the business, and therefore less and less people, less and less farm was producing non-GMO soybeans in Brazil, and therefore Europe didn't have as much supply as they had originally. The US was already GMO, so they had to develop Ukraine and use Ukraine as the main source of non-GMO to the European crushers. So they're very good in communicating. So they have communicated to the end user that GMO were not good, and the American fast food was using GMO, and that was creating other problems. And Brazilians were following the Americans, and therefore they were doing things that they without knowing what they're doing, and now they are using technology to destroy the Amazon. So this whole discussion is very convoluted. It has to have again a dialogue to put things in their own position. If we don't have GMO, if you don't use GMO, the cost of food will be much higher. And I don't think that the developing countries, the developing populations throughout the world will have enough purchasing power to feed themselves. So I'm not saying this is something that has to be done whatever, but we are developing, and we have proved that GMO hasn't had any effect in humans' health throughout the whole time that has been in place. So again, communication is key, but I think we are here not asking for excuses for anything. We're doing a business, and we need to communicate it better.
True, true. So before I turn to Q&A from the participants, the point is we are Brazil and US big agri players, and with a huge potential of expansion through Asia and the demand to feed the population, increase the population. But we need to better communicate what we have been doing, especially in relation to sustainability, because this is what Australians do very well. This is why I brought to the discussion, because when you buy a kilo of meat, Australian meat, we pay more. In US, this is really common. We pay more if it's Australian than if it's Brazilian. This is something because there is no enough clear and transparent communication what both countries have been doing in relation to sustainability. So something to think about. So we have many questions, and I'm going to start. John, are you going to, would you like to have, can I move to the questions, or
yes,
would you like to make?
I can do the questions if you like.
All right, okay.
You know, I think we have quite a few, and we're getting short on time. So let me try to combine some of them. We have two that are very related. How do you view the capital needs and capital raising process, debt and equity in a COVID, post-COVID environment, where there will be clearly less travel between Brazil and key source locations? And also, yes, there's also very good ag producers in Brazil. Many have long-term offtake agreements that should be viable collateral. However, international financiers have been stung, particularly in the sugar and ethanol space, where they have been several high-profile defaults and restructurings, and where mediocre players were previously subsidized by the BNDES. The weaker real, stronger dollar has helped with the current profitability, as you mentioned, Secretary Junqueira, despite continued low sugar prices. But many zombie companies remain, not only in sugar. What can be done to address this, and in the long run, shore up credit quality in general in the industry, and I would say collateral as well?
Well, it's a long question, a lot of things. Yes. Let's start with the end. What we saw during the COVID pandemic was, and the oil prices at the same time, was a perfect storm where sugar and ethanol producers in Brazil and in the US, for that matter, were not expecting that. Actually, they were expecting the opposite. This year was supposed to be a great year for ethanol. And demand has dropped significantly. People stayed at their homes. We had here in Brazil, during the month of May, 2 or 3 weeks where the drop in fuel consumption was close to 70%. So no market can sustain a drop of 70% in their consumption of their product. Fortunately, it lasted for a few weeks, and then it came back, and now I think it's close to a 30% drop of last year's consumption numbers. It's still a lot if you think of all the capacity that has been put in place to produce ethanol, and therefore at the same time we had a very huge drop in oil prices, and Petrobras, which is a big competitor for the Brazilian ethanol business, because they are the sole or the largest producer of gasoline, had no places to store their gasoline. So they were pumping oil, and they had the same problem with storage that the US had, in a different pace, in a different dynamic. But if the market didn't come back to this level of consumption that we see today, and it is a threat that we have going on, is that we may not have storage to store the ethanol and the gasoline. So this is going to create a major problem in terms of pricing and logistics in Brazil. BNDES hasn't stepped up, different from different crises in the past. It hasn't stepped up, hasn't granted any financing, any special financing at this time. It is working, still working on the storage program for ethanol, but it actually hasn't gone to these companies. And whenever it goes, it will go based on credit ratings. So what we see here as an effect of COVID, I think in Brazil, in the US, we're going to see consolidation. There's no way companies are not going to take advantage of consolidation in all different aspects, because raising capital now, either equity or debt, will be done through players that are known, names that are known, because the difficulty of doing a roadshow or the ability to get across in a Zoom conference like we're doing here today is different from the face-to-face. So the players that are well positioned today, they will take advantage. So we're going to see consolidation going forward. I guess different from the US, Brazilian sugar mills take longer to shut down because here, once you invest in a business, and this is a major difference of risk between the US and Brazil, you bet the ranch, as the Americans say, because you put all your guarantees, you sign a how do you say that in English? I forgot now, but you have the vow, which is you gave all your guarantee as guarantee to that business. In the US, okay, I'm going to put $10 million. It's $10 million, regardless if I have another $100 million in other business. Here, no, if you start that business, you're putting all your assets behind it. So that's why companies take long to die. In the US, you shut down and you do a stop loss and it's done. Here, no, here you have to keep up. So that makes the market less effective and less agile as in the US. So let's see and see what happens.
We have a question from a friend, Valmor. Thank you, Valmor, for sending this. It's for Professor Nicholas. What's the economic dynamics behind the negative return of the grain business in US during the last few years? And in addition, would you commenting about the world, mainly in Asia and China, demand outlook for grains? Professor?
Sure. So I mean, I can give a simple answer, and then I can also give a much more complicated answer to explain the simple answer. It's low prices. We've seen a huge decline in commodity prices, particularly for corn and soybeans, basically since 2013. The high prices that we saw prior to that, again, I think due in large part primarily to the explosive growth in corn demand for ethanol production that we saw over a 5 or 6 year period here in the US. They had the effect of naturally increasing input prices, including not only just seed, fertilizers, and other productive inputs, but also the demand for farmland and the effect that had on what we talk about as the cash rental market for farmland. Since then, for various reasons, we've had, not that we haven't continued to have strong global demand, but since 2013, we've had very good, in general, growing conditions throughout much of the world, whether that's the summer here in the Northern Hemisphere or our winter when you're growing your primary crop in the Southern Hemisphere. We've built up some pretty large stocks globally of both corn and soybeans, and that's led to much lower prices. The trade war that farmers have had to deal with since 2018 have been kind of an additional negative impact domestically that has added to the problem. And then, most recently, the COVID, the pandemic and the impacts from COVID that have continued to destroy demand and keep commodity prices even lower. We haven't seen production costs adjust. They've remained relatively stable since 2013. So grain farmers are basically operating now under a cost structure that was the result of a very high income period, but now we're back to much lower commodity prices, and we have not yet seen the adjustment on the cost side to kind of bring things back into balance. So that's my answer on the dynamics behind the low incomes we've seen. In terms of the outlook for demand from Asia and more specifically China, I'm going to rely on some comments that were made by a colleague of mine who's an agricultural economist from China. We did a webinar together last month, kind of talking about this exact issue. And the trade war notwithstanding, and some of those short-term issues that we're continuing to work through between China and the U.S. specifically, I think from a global perspective, he was very optimistic about continued growth in China. Obviously, they're going to be going through a recovery period now, during this pandemic, and as we work through it, as all countries across the globe are. But I think longer term, the outlook is very positive for a continued increase in demand for grains to feed their domestic livestock industry, or increased demand for feed for livestock that countries like the U.S. and Brazil raise to ultimately export directly to China and some of the other Asian countries. So, I mean, again, moderate to long term, I think very, very optimistic for continued growth. It's the next 2 to 3 year period I'm less optimistic about.
John, can you move with the next?
Yes, it's having trouble unmuting. Sorry about that. Okay, this question comes from Dr. Mark Baptista he's the CEO of Medical Agribusiness. And a question for everyone: is there more of an opportunity for overall agribusiness growth arising in the northeastern part of Brazil, or is it still going to come from the other 4 regions?
Can you repeat, John?
Yeah, it's not São Paulo specific. The question is the prospects for agribusiness growth in the Northeast compared to the other 4 regions.
Yeah, I think the Midwest and the southeast of Brazil are and the south are the main players. The northeast of Brazil, you have an area in Bahia, which is West Bahia, that works very well. That has been important contributor to especially to the cotton and the soybean business. But it's more limited because the expansion there, first infrastructure, and then the rain, right? The droughts, and it's a more fragile area they will grow. I think you see probably more growth coming from productivity gains than land expansion in that area. If I could highlight another thing here, John, regarding to the previous questions to Professor Nick, I'm optimistic in the short term for Brazil and for the U.S. in terms of agribusiness. But there's one point that I want to highlight that should be a point of concern, because that will have an effect in markets and prices, which is the return of China to the pork business. We have been very fortunate, quote unquote, here for China to have lived a African swine flu that has decimated approximately 40 to 50% of their total pork business. because that pork business was based in small holders, family holders that has, I don't know, 10 pigs, or and that business is not a healthy sanitary business, as we know, and we have seen that when we were kids. And the industry in the U.S. and in Brazil has transformed to a very hospital-like operation, which is not true in China. But now that they have made the decision to slaughter and kill all these pigs in these conditions, now they were going to come back. I'm sure they're going to come back with a very modern Brazilian/American based model, and that will trigger changes in the market, both corn and soybeans, because they're probably going to demand more down the road. But at the same time, the meat market that has been being so good in the last years. So that's something that investors have to be aware going forward, and that's my view as a Secretary of Agriculture, because I have to focus on what farmers are investing now, because that will take time. They're going to grow their business, and therefore down the road, 2 or 3 years, that may not pay off, as Nick just highlighted the ethanol case. So I just want to make the bridge here.
Can I add to that? Can I add,
yes.
add one thing to that?
Yes.
I couldn't agree with the Secretary's comments more about one, some of the short term the positives from probably both Brazilian and U.S. perspective in terms of the major increases we've seen in pork exports to China, and I more technology based and similar to what we do in the U.S. and what you do in Brazil. The one hope I have maybe is not a disagreement, but maybe a bit of a counterpoint or something to think about related to that. Again, I'm relying on my colleague from China who brought this up last month, was that because Chinese are not consuming as much pork right now, it may open up tastes and interest to some of the other types of protein products that we could provide that market. So, he mentioned Chinese are eating more chicken, more beef, and even growth in demand for dairy. So again, I totally agree on the changes that'll happen in their pork industry, but maybe one silver lining is that we could develop some Chinese demand for some alternative proteins as well.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you.
Go back to
Secretary.
Communication and marketing, right, Nick?
Yes. Again. And I have one last question that goes to Secretary Gustavo Junqueira. It comes from Alexandre Falcão, and it's about one program that I really love. It's RenovaBio. So Alexandre asked the Secretary, can you talk about how RenovaBio will change the sugar and ethanol industry, and how it's São Paulo state government preparing for that?
It's a good question. It's still a question that we are focusing on the domestic market, so it's difficult to make this comparison and explain all that. And I'm not an expert by any chance in the RenovaBio, but the RenovaBio, it's in English would be RenewBio. It's a certificate. It's a seal of approval of a sustainable operation for ethanol and sugar production, that you go all the way to the chain. So if the farmer is more sustainable, you have a point. If the transportation of the raw material to the crusher is done in a sustainable way, you have one more point. If the sugar mill or the ethanol processing plant has more sustainable or environmental policies, that you got more points. And all that makes you a bond, a certificate that you can trade. So it's 100% based on the private market, where you're going to negotiate those certificates. To whom? Very similar to what the U.S. RFSA, yeah, the whole policy that the U.S. government has implemented back in the 2000, where you have to have at least X% of the ethanol in the energy mix. Here, what we have done is that the companies that sell fuel, if they consume fuel, they have to buy those certificates so they can be hedged in terms of carbon printing. I don't know more details than that, but what I see here is that we as Brazilians were able to put together a private business of sustainability that has been tried for many years, and no one actually has, and the market hasn't taken off. Now we believe, because we have scale and because we have a product that is yet a domestic product but can be invested by foreigners, because, for example, we have this Norwegian investment fund that wants to offset their carbon printing of other investments that they have, I don't know, whale fishing or oil exploration in the North Sea. They can come to Brazil and buy these renewable certificates and offset their whole portfolio. So and this is going to be traded in the Brazilian stock exchange. So it's something that we're going to have transparency. So I'm very optimistic. Again, one thing that we have to be very cautious when discussing the Brazilian agribusiness. This is the most private business in Brazil. And a secretary of agriculture working for the government, but having a private sector background, I want to keep it as a private business. So the less interference that we have of the government in anything related to agribusiness in Brazil, the better it is. So what I see is that not much that the government of São Paulo should do or can do, but we're gonna foster as much as we can. We have a very open dialogue with the Sugarcane Association here in Brazil, and we're gonna help in any way.
Thank you, Secretary Junqueira. Just one last question before we wrap up. Nick, I think you wanted to address the financing question.
You are on mute.
Nick, you there?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't hear the question, John.
You said you wanted to address the financing question. That one sort of left.
Oh, sure. Aside. Yeah, I mean the financing situation in the U.S. for U.S. ag, I guess the key points are that you know, there's, I think, increasing concern in the ag credit, ag lending community across the country about the low incomes that we've seen the last 6 years. But you know, we came into that 6-year period in a very strong position. So a lot of times we like to look back in the U.S. and compare where we're currently at to the last time we experienced an agricultural crisis, which was in the 1980s. The big difference, one of the big differences today from that time frame was the fact that we have historically low interest rates, including those for agricultural loans. We have a strong government-sponsored farm credit system, which provides credit at very favorable interest rates to farmers, in addition to the private commercial banking sector. And even though we've seen low incomes and cash flow issues on a number of operations, the delinquency rates, the performance of agricultural loans has remained very good. Again, lenders are always worried not so much about what happened last year, but what's going to happen in the upcoming cycle. So there's always concern there. But I would say that performance of ag lending in the U.S. has been very good. We've got the low interest rate environment, and that's really as long as we don't see a big hit to asset values, particularly land values. I think that will continue to be the case. We've got a very strong solvency position in the U.S. from a balance sheet perspective, very low debt, relative to the asset values that farmers hold. So, it's purely right now a hopefully short-term cash flow issue that lending institutions can work through that. It's just a question of how long that might last.
Well, I wanted to thank you all very much for attending, and especially our panelists, Secretary Junqueira, Professor Paulson, and Ana Malvestio. This was a fantastic discussion, and thank you all for joining again. Our next webinar will take place next Tuesday, the 30th of June at 10 a.m. We'll have our second edition of the series, COVID-19 Next Steps. This one is Investing in the Power Sector in Brazil, Opportunities and Challenges. Thank you all for attending. Stay healthy and in good spirits. Thank you, panelists.